proceed to begin the session. So we will proceed to begin the session. So I would like welcome to our first speaker, Debojyoti Roy Choudhury from IIT Madras. And the title of the talk is Impact of Non-Lanthanide Ions on the Structural and Luminescence Properties of Up-Converting Phosphors. So over to you, Debojyoti. You can start sharing your screen and proceed with the talk. Thank you.
Okay. Now is my screen visible to all of you?
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay. Let me go to the presentation mode. So, am I audible clearly to all of you?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So today, the title of my talk is the impact of the non-lanthanide ions on the structural and luminescence properties of the up-converting phosphor. So, let me go to the actually contents. I have arranged the presentation in this way. First, I will give a short introduction. Then I will discuss about the photon upconversion process in the organic and inorganic material. Then the photon synthesis methods I will shortly discuss, and then the material characterization methods, and then I will discuss about the project which is the effect of the non-lanthanide ions on the structural properties of the upconverting phosphor, and on the luminescence properties of the upconverting phosphor, and application of the rare earth doped upconverting phosphor. Then I will discuss the references where I have taken the help. So first, the introduction. Uh, uh, to get with the introduction, we should know about the four terms, that is the photon upconversion. So what is the photon upconversion? Actually, photon upconversion is the procedure. It is a nonlinear optical phenomenon in which we are getting a high energy photon from two or more low energy photon. So we are giving as input two or more low energy photon, and we are getting a high energy photon. But one point should be noted here, that the high energy photon, the energy of the photon is not added linearly of the input photons which we are giving, and it is an anti-Stokes emission type. So it can be regarded as a Raman emission, and it is subdivided in the actually the anti-Stokes Raman emission. Phosphor. So phosphors are defined as the substances exhibiting the photoluminescence, which is the phosphorescence and the fluorescence property. That means emits light when it is exposed to the specific electromagnetic radiation. And the application of the phosphors and in the optical thermometry, postage stamp, as well as the radioluminescence, electroluminescence, LEDs, etc. And next, we should know about the host material. So host material is an important term, and it is actually vital for performing the optical phenomenon, this kind of nonlinear optical phenomenon, that is the photon upconversion. The host material give the perfect environment to the dopants to achieve the significant luminescence. And the host matrix or the host materials, which we can say, should have some actually should have some specific properties, like the host material must have the low phonon frequency, because we need low non-radiative relaxation rate, as well as the chemical and thermal stability should be high for the host material, and host matrix should have the high refractive index, as well as the low toxicity of the host is great demand in different applications. And what is the activator and the sensitizer ion? The activator ion is defined as the external ion, which is placed into a host lattice, generating a center which may be excited to the luminescence. And the activator is considered as the dopant for a crystal, and it may generate the desired non-homogeneities in the material. And the sensitizer is also an external ion, which is placed into the host lattice or the matrix, and it is able to transfer its excitation energy to the nearest activator ion. And in this way, it emits light while transferring the energy, and it is the activator and the sensitizer ion. How the red color is actually showing the dopant, and here the dopant in the host matrix is activated and sensitizer ion both. Now we will see later when we will call some ion as the activator ion and when it is the sensitizer ion. Now, few basic terms, as I have already started the discussion with a new phenomenon, that is the photon upconversion phenomenon, which is a non-linear phenomenon. It takes place both in the organic and the inorganic materials, but we are interested mainly in the inorganic materials, in which we have actually practiced the photon upconversion phenomenon. And the photon upconversion phenomenon actually occurs in the actinide materials, transition material, but mainly in the rare earth elements, which includes the lanthanide sheets and scandium, yttrium, etc. One most important thing which I want to mention about the photon upconversion, that it generally takes place through the 4f-4f transition, atomic transition, which is actually forbidden according to the Laporte's selection rule, but it takes place due to the magnetic quadrupole dipole and the electronic interaction between the levels. The photon upconversion occurs through three different and distinct processes in the inorganic material. One is the energy transfer upconversion, ETU, excited state absorption, ES, and the photon avalanche, PA. And in the organic material, it generally takes place through the two different methods. One is the sensitized triplet annihilation, another one is the energy pooling. Now we will discuss with the three distinguished methods of the photon upconversion in the inorganic materials. The first one is the ETU, energy transfer upconversion. One of the most efficient energy transfer process in the rare earth doped nanomaterials, and I cannot explain in detail here. It involves the a mutual interaction between the two ions, that is the activator and the sensitizer ion, which is seen from the figure. And the basic requirement for this process is the concentration of ion should be sufficient to allow the energy migration between the neighbor ions. And sometimes ETU is called as the addition of the photons by transfer of energy, which is APTE. And ETU is independent of the pumping power, which is most important characteristics of this process. And the ion which is excited here is actually called the sensitizer ion, and to which the energy is transferred is called the activator ion. The next one is the excited state absorption, which is the multi-step excitation process, and in which the intermediate reservoir state is present, and through which it actually finally populates the excited state, where the upconversion, that is the photoluminescence, actually takes place. The GS means the ground state absorption, ES means the excited state absorption, ET is the energy transfer. The next one is the photon avalanche. Photon avalanche is one of the most efficient upconversion process, which involves the energy transfer through the cross relaxation methods between the two neighboring ions. And it, for now, it can be regarded as the process of adding the three nonlinear optical behavior, that is the transmission, emission, and the rise time, respectively. As well as if we see the phosphor synthesis method, there are different actually there are different types of the phosphor synthesis method. The first one is the conventional solid state synthesis process, and this actually refers to the heating of the two non-volatile reacting solids. Non-volatile reacting solid means a solid that generally react to produce the required product, and this method is generally used to prepare a lot of materials, including the sulfate, metal oxide, nitrides, etc., as well as the sol gel synthesis method, which is the process, actually two-step process. First, we prepare the sol and then the gel. It is a procedure in which we can produce the solid materials with small molecules as the reactants. And the next is the co-precipitation synthesis, which is the classical synthesis method in which the nanomaterials are formed from the aqueous solution. And then the hydrothermal synthesis method. The hydrothermal synthesis method is aqueous media reaction method synthesis, which is used to fabricate different kind of the nanomaterials. Now I am coming to the material characterization method directly. The first figure that you can see, actually what we have done in our project, we have taken the calcium titanium oxide, CaTiO3, as the host material. That the host material I have already discussed, and the ytterbium and yttrium, ER and Y, we have taken as the activator and sensitizer ion respectively. And we have doped with the sodium and lithium, which is the non-lanthanide ions, because we are wanting to see the effect of the non-lanthanide ion doping on the host material and the lanthanide ions. So here, let me take the help of the laser pointer. It will be better. So the actually it is the X-ray diffraction pattern. You can see from this the intensity in the arbitrary units versus the 2 theta. The figure A shows you the Er3 plus doped calcium titanium oxide, and you can see the intensity is quite small for this, but when we are doping with the Er3 plus Yb3 plus CaTiO3 for the figure B, which is seen that the intensity is improving. And for the C, when we are doping with the sodium with the ytterbium and yttrium CaTiO3, we can see the intensity is quite improving. And for the D, when the host material with the lanthanide materials and non-lanthanide materials, that is the sodium and lithium, both are doped here, we can get the maximum intensity. So it is our main purpose to increase the upconversion intensity. This is the intensity versus 2 theta graph for a specific HKL 112. You know the Miller indices. The figure A, B, C, D, as I have told here. Actually, this is taken for the specific, that is the 112, for which we are getting the maximum intensity for all the figures here that we have taken here, the specific peak. And the third one is showing the Williamson-Hall plot. We have plotted with the use of the COMSOL multiphysics using the Williamson-Hall equation that I cannot explain here now, right now. And this is the FESM, the Fourier electron scanning electron microscope images we can see from the here ABCD. Actually, we can see the first one, which is the Er3 plus doped CaTiO3, and the second one is the Er3 plus Yb3 plus doped CaTiO3, and the third one when we are doping with the non-lanthanide ion sodium, and the fourth one is the sodium and lithium both. So you can see that when we are doping with the actually the non-lanthanide ion, the size will be smaller and it is showing some kind of more compact. So the crystallinity is increasing in that case, which is proved by the FESM images. This is the EDAX image, that is the energy dispersion X-ray diagram. We can see from here, from which we can actually calculate the weight of each of the component used here. The first one is the EDAX image, the corresponding EDAX color mapping, and the elemental distribution of the Er3 plus Yb3 plus Na plus Li plus CaTiO3 phosphate is seen here. And this is the figure I want to describe in small. Actually, this is the upconversion spectra, the intensity versus wavelength actually curve, and the corresponding electronic level transition is shown for the ABCD. The insert diagram I don't want to explain right now. Just see this figure. We can see that the ABCD is, as I have already told, A is for the Er3 plus doped CaTiO3, then the Er3 plus Yb3 plus doped CaTiO3, then the Na plus doped Er3 plus Yb3 plus CaTiO3, then Na plus Li plus sodium and lithium both doped Er3 plus Yb3 plus CaTiO3. So you can see that when we are doping with the
Sorry for interrupting,
non-lanthanide
Subodh Jyoti.
materials.
Your 12 minutes
Okay.
is over. Please try to end as soon as
Okay,
possible.
I am trying
Thank
to end
you.
within 1 minute. Okay. So we can see from here that with actually doping with the non-lanthanide materials, upconversion intensity is increasing. And what I am trying to say, the luminescence properties can be improved when we are actually indulging the appropriate stoichiometric amount of the non-lanthanide ions. And in this case, the CaTiO3 is considered as the host material, Er3 plus as the activator, Yb3 plus as the sensitizer, and the crystallinity of the actually crystal is increased when we are doping with the non-lanthanide elements, and the it is also helpful in decreasing the number of the localized defect state, as well as we can see that non-lanthanide ions are acting as the charge compensator, and we have experimentally seen that this combination achieves the optimum upconversion emission intensity, and in overall the non-lanthanide ions gives us more efficient improved upconverting phosphor. Now why we can use this process? Because it has a huge application in the photoluminescence based industry, like in the display device, LED, FED, and lighting application, in the biomedical application, medical diagnosis, in the security, ink application to read and write the invisible watt, as well as the temperature sensing, and FIA technique, fluorescence intensity ratio technique, as well as in the therapeutic and the biological applications. And this is the reference where I have taken this, and we have performed some experiment. And at last, thanks for listening. And if you have any further question, you can mail me also. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so now it's time for question answer session, and there is a question from R.P. Bhaskaran, that why is the photon avalanche process most efficient?
Okay, so photon avalanche process is most efficient among the three processes I have discussed, because the photon avalanche process is the process which is happening between the two ions. It is an energy transfer process, you can assume. When the energy is transferring from the level 1 to level 2, there is a sub energy state, you can assume, where the ion can stay, and finally then it can be converted to the final state, and it relaxed from the final excited state to the intermediate state or the ground state. It can take energy from the sub intermediate stages, where it may relax before reaching the final excited state. So taking the energy from the intermediate state, it can take another kind of photoluminescence effect, and in between from the final excited state to the ground state, there may have numerous number of the sub intermediate stages. So it can create an avalanche process. So you can see actually tremendous number of the photoluminescence effect in between the stages. Actually, that is why the photoluminescence effect is quite effective through the photon avalanche process. So photon upconversion is the most efficient and most well observed through this photon avalanche process. That is the reason, because it is actually avalanche effect, which is not created in the other two processes. There are one or two step process. Here we can get the avalanche of the photon. Many number of photons created. That is why.
Okay, Debojyoti, thank you for this wonderful talk. And due to short time, let's move on to our next speaker.
Okay.
So our second speaker,
Stop saying.
Yeah. So our second speaker, Pragati Gupta from ISC Bengaluru. And over to you, Pragati. You can start sharing your screen and proceed.
Okay. I guess you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity. So, I'm going to talk about the ground state phases of amorphous Z2 gauge theory. Okay, I admit this is a very long and fancy title. So to give you an idea, the background shows the kind of amorphous, that is disordered systems, that we have studied the Z2 gauge theory on. And I would like to thank my collaborator and supervisor, Professor Vijay Shenoy from ISC, for supervising this work. Okay, so this topic lies at the intersection of quantum computation and condensed matter physics. A quantum computer is basically a device that uses the principles of quantum mechanics to give you a computer that is much faster than classical computers. A classical computer uses the bit as its basis of its information, which can take the value 0 or a 1. In a quantum computer, you use qubit as the basis of information, which can take a state, which is a superposition of the state 0 and the state 1. So in a quantum computer, you can take a superposition of two states, and this is responsible for the exponential growth in power that we hope to see in quantum computers. Now take a qubit, for example. So one of the systems that can be a qubit is a quantum spin system. So a quantum spin system has two basis states, a spin up state and a spin down state. So a general state of the qubit can be represented as an alpha up plus a beta down state. Now this qubit interacts with its environment, and fluctuations and the interaction between the environment and the qubit can change the state of the system. Now, if I use this qubit to store quantum information on a quantum computer, any interaction with the environment can easily change the state of the system. So my quantum information is not secure. I cannot reliably use this qubit to store my information. So instead, I need a more robust way to store my information and protect it from errors. So entanglement is a way where I can delocalize my information from one qubit to multiple qubits. So for example, if I take one qubit of information that can be represented as basis state of 0 and 1, I can take two more qubits and delocalize my one qubit information on 3 qubits. So the state 0 goes to 0, 0, 0, and the state 1 goes to 1, 1, 1. Now, even if an error occurs on one of these 3 qubits, say it occurs on the first qubit, even then I have two other qubits which are in the original state. So I can take a majority rule and find the original intended state of the system. So this way, even if there are errors on single qubits in this in these 3 qubit system, I can still recover my quantum information reliably. So entanglement, which delocalizes the information, protects the information that is stored from local errors. By local, I mean local on each single qubit of the system. Now, creating entanglement on a many-body system leads to something called a toric code. So toric code is a many-body system consisting of spins sitting on a lattice. So here what you see is this figure. So each spin is marked as this round. And these spins interact with their neighbors using these placket operators. So placket operators marked in this orange, which is marked as BP. So a placket basically is an interaction between these 4 terms around a particular face. And it also interacts with its vertex neighbors. So if you take this, for example, so it coincides with this vertex, and so it will interact with these 4 qubits over here. So this at each vertex you have this interaction, and at each face you have this interaction. So there is a lot of interaction that happens between these spins, and this interaction creates a highly entangled state. The toric code is basically a sum of interaction terms at each vertex and at each placket. So in this toric code, you observe long-range entanglement, and we expect to protect our information, our encoded information, using this entanglement. Now, in this lattice system, if you identify or join the top and the bottom edge, which is, so if you roll this top and the bottom edge and then join together, that makes a cylinder, right? And if you once making a cylinder, then you identify the left and the right edge. So that is like rolling the cylinder and joining the open circular edges together. So that gives you the shape of a torus. So periodic boundary conditions on the square lattice or any 2D lattice will give you a torus. So this shape of a torus or this topology is what gives this name or this model the toric code. Okay. Now the ground state of this toric code has 4-fold degeneracy. What I mean by that is, so you start with a uniform system where all the spins, so there'll be spins all over here. I'm not showing the spins over here. So there'll be spins over here, and you can arrange them in a regular state. Now take take a loop or take a string of qubits sitting on a loop which runs from left to the right. So it goes completely from left to the other corner and right. So this, and flip all computation, there are two kinds of flips that you can do. You can do a bit flip, so which changes this state 0 to 1, which corresponds to the poly operator Z, and there's a phase flip which corresponds to the poly operator X. So you can do two kind of flips. You can do a phase flip, which is X, and you can do a bit flip, which is Z. So you can do this on two kinds of loops. So one is a loop that runs from left to the right, and another is the one that runs from top to the bottom. Now, on the torus, when I have done when I've put in the periodic boundary condition, these loops correspond to these non-trivial loops on the torus. So one is a loop that runs around the torus, and another is a loop that runs through the torus. So if you notice, these are the two topologically non-trivial loops of a torus. So I have encoded my information on topologically non-trivial states of the system. So my information is protected by topology. What I mean by that is, so if I have an error, say on a qubit over here, but unless there are errors on each qubit around a loop which runs throughout this torus or through this torus, my encoded information does not change. So which means my information is topologically protected. So now to ensure my information is protected, I should ensure that the errors do not move around these topologically non-trivial loops on the torus. So this brings us to the question, can we make a very robust quantum memory if I ensure that the errors are localized in a region? And this brings us to the possibility that, so there's some phenomena called Anderson localization, which happens in disordered systems where a quantum particle or a quasi-particle is localized to a region because of disorder. So in my work, we have explored whether disorder can bring some localization of errors in the toric code so that we get a robust quantum memory. To explore our question, we note that toric code is equivalent to the Z2 gauge theory in some limit. Now, so we saw the Hamiltonian of the toric code, and the Hamiltonian of the Z2 gauge theory is basically you take all the vertex operators to be one. That's called the Gates constraint. That's a technical thing, not that important for our understanding right now. So you take a system where you have these Plaquette terms and a magnetic field in which the system is present. So J is the coupling of the Plaquette terms, which tells you how strong the couplings are between the qubits. And G is the term which tells you how strong the coupling to the magnetic strength is. Now, one thing is to note that if the magnetic strength is strong, the spins will couple to the magnetic field strongly and fluctuate more vigorously. But the more they fluctuate, the more there'll be errors. So what we expect is, so under some value of G, under some value of the magnetic field, we expect some order in the system, and above which we do not expect some order. We expect if the magnetic field is too high or the coupling is too high with the magnetic field, everything will be disordered. So the error threshold for the quantum memory corresponds to the phase transition in the system. So in our case, we do the same analysis for an amorphous system, and we find that if you take an amorphous system, so you can, so this is like a random graph, and which has some vertices, some edges, and face and some faces, so which are marked respectively. And the Euler's theorem suggests that so the V plus F minus E gives you 2 minus 2G, which using some maths gives you the formula that the ground state degeneracy is 4 pi G. Now, what is G over here? G is the genus of the surface. So genus is a topological term which corresponds to the number of holes in the system. So for example, over here, but you see this has one hole in the system. So you can notice that the statements I'm making over here have a lot to do with topology or the geometry of the system. So based on the kind of geometry that you have in the system, you find that the ground state can be degenerate or not. And since we are talking about a torus which has one genus, so 4 by G is 1, so we can be sure that our system will have ground state degeneracy of 4. So we're sure we'll have a deconfined phase, which is an ordered phase, and a confined phase, which is a disordered phase, as the G by J value rises. So the question is, how is the phase transition, which corresponds to the accuracy for errors? So we did some simulations and we found that in a clean system, so I call the clean system by the square lattice that I showed you at the very first slide. And the amorphous lattice is this kind of lattice as shown in the background in the first slide, or as over here. So we find, so basically phase transitions are characterized using the critical value at which the phase transition happens. And there's also some dynamical exponents that we talk about when we talk about phase transition. So in clean system, we found that it's known that the G by J value is 0.35. In the amorphous system, it's 0.710. Now, this is not the interesting part. The interesting part is the Z value. So Z is a dynamical exponent which tells you how random is the system. So if you have a finite value of Z, which means the system is not random. Now it can happen that you can have a very random system, but which can still show finite value, which means that the randomness is not relevant. But in our case, we observe that the Z value goes from a finite amount to infinity, which means that the disorder present in the system is very strong and it affects the kind of phase transition that we observe. So when in case you see a Z is equal to infinity, another parameter that is a psi value becomes important, which we find the value to be 1.15. So our phase diagram becomes that we have a phase transition from a deconfined phase to a confined phase with an infinite randomness critical point. Now, there's something called a Griffith singularity as well. So Griffith singularity is when, so generally in a clean system, you have a disordered system and an ordered phase, and there's a phase transition. Now, when you have disordered systems, you can have a disordered bulk phase, but you can have small islands of local order. So here the yellow is the disordered region, and you can have small islands of local order. So we hope to see this in the system, but we are still exploring that. Now, the interpretation of the results.
Sorry
So
for interrupting, Pragati.
Yes, this is the
Time
last.
over.
Yes.
Yeah. Please try to end.
Yes, thank you. So the randomness comes from the coordination number, variation of the coordination number of the lattice. And we have seen that the lattice disorder leads to an infinite randomness critical point. Okay, so further outlook is that you can talk about amorphous systems with dependent couplings, and then interpret these results, whether we are able to localize the error or not, and what does the infinite randomness critical point mean for quantum computation. So these are topics for further study. Now some fun facts about this work. So I used Monte Carlo technique for this work, and I did a simulation over 2 to the power 16 Monte Carlo steps. Okay, and 1,000 disorder configurations. So I took 1,000 random graphs and averaged my results over them. I used 2 computational clusters, which is about a 200 cores to find the critical point, and that used 100,000 core hours. Okay, so that's the some fun facts, and thank you. Are there any questions?
Okay, thanks. And now it's time for question answer session. There is a question from Anamitra Mondol that the toric code is because of toroidal shape, right? And is it possible to generate any other shape? And I mean, what is the significance of this toroidal shape? So this was the question.
Yeah, that's a very nice question. So the toroidal shape, as I told you, it tells you how much degenerate the system will be. So so irrespective of whatever lattice you take, so depending on the depending on the fact that it's a torus, you see a fourfold degenerate state. If it was a different state, say if you did not take a torus, so you took something like a sphere which has no holes. So that will be, so our degeneracy would be 4 to the power 0, which is 1. So which means we just have a single ground state, and you cannot use that for quantum computation. So yes, the toroidal shape, or for that matter, the topology is what is significant in this work. Yes.
Okay, so there is another question from Saurabh. Why are we only considering only the ground state of the system here and not any excited state?
Yes. So we are taking the ground state because if you want to encode quantum information, so like in a classical system, if you want to encode classical, so you have a bit which is 0 and 1, and 0 and 1 are equivalent. So they are 2 different states, but they're equivalent. Now, if in a quantum system, we have a system, if we encode our information on some on the ground state and some on the excited state, there'll be just a leakage of information from one state to the other, even without us encoding that into the system. So we want it to be a degenerate ground state of the system. Also, ground state is, I mean, it's more stable state, and if one of the excited states degenerates, so it goes under a loss of energy, that will come down to the ground state. So it's better to start with the ground state itself.
Okay. So there is another question from Somnath Roy, that what is the physical significance of the infinite randomness?
Yes. So physical system of the infinite randomness is, so this has to do with renormalization group. So in renormalization group, what you see is, if I go to higher and higher scales, that is, it's like this. So if you keep a random system in front of you and you go away from it, if you take say 10 steps and then 20 steps and then 100 steps away from it, does the disorder average out or does the disorder stay? So in some systems, the disorder can average out, like overall it will look, more or less like averaged out. And in some systems, it will not average out. So the fact that it's infinite randomness tells you that even at higher orders of, so if you go to larger and larger lattices, the randomness will stay. So that's the significance of infinite randomness.
Okay, so there is a last question. How can we extract the information from the strongly entangled state?
Yes. So how you extract the information from a strongly entangled state is that, so you can basically, so the operators that I showed, the vertex and the Plaquette operators, they can be used to measure the state without so in a quantum state, that if you measure the state completely, you have destroyed the state, right? We don't want to do that. So what we do is, so if you notice, each vertex of the Plaquette operator does not go over the whole system, it only goes over the local region. So what we do is, we measure each local region and then we try to piece together the information. So that's how you get the information from a strongly entangled local state. And I understand there can be more questions, and you can reach me at this email address or on the Slack for more questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pragati, for this wonderful talk. And let's move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker, Agnibha Ganguly from Presidency University, Kolkata. So over to you, Agnibha. You can start sharing your screen and go.
Okay, thank you. Let me share. So am I audible?
Yes, you are.
My slides are visible, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I am Agnibha Ganguly from Presidency University, Kolkata. Firstly, I would like to thank Team Precision for giving me such an opportunity. And today's topic of my talk is machine learning in chemoinformatics and drug discovery. So first of all, a quick overview of chemoinformatics. For past few decades, there has been an enormous increase in chemical data from both chemistry as well as biological area. So it has become almost incomprehensible for a mere human to work with such enormous amount of data and come up with a constructive inference. Thus, chemoinformatics unifies computer and chemistry with the goal of utilizing computer information technology to solve problems in field of chemistry, such as chemical information retrieval and extraction, compound database searching, and molecular graph mining. So how can we convert these 3D chemical structures into quality or relevant chemical information, which could be stored in computer and could be used? So there are a number of approaches. One of the most important approaches is the chemical graph theory. Chemical graph theory is the topological branch of mathematical chemistry, which applies graph theory to mathematical modeling of chemical phenomena. It is actually a graphical construct which converts a 3D chemical structure into a graph where the atoms are denoted as the vertices, and the bonds, atomic bonds between two atoms is denoted as edges. So it is a mathematical construct comprising of an order pair V and E. So here is a dopamine molecule, and beside that is the graphical representation of the which has been created from a software, the graphical representation of the dopamine molecule. Another important approach is the chemical descriptors. Chemical descriptor can be of three types: one-dimensional, two-dimensional, and three or four-dimensional descriptors. The one-dimensional descriptor stores information such as atom counts, bond counts, molecular weight, sum of atomic properties, or fragment counts. The 2D descriptors include topological indices, molecular profiles, and 2D autocorrelation descriptors. And lastly, the 3D and 4D descriptors contains the surfaces to volume descriptor and other quantum chemical descriptors. Mole2 system and Dragon system are two such models or systems which can generate a huge amount of descriptors from a large compound database. Another important approach is the chemical fingerprints. So each and every molecule has an unique data set which is known as the chemical fingerprints, and which can be used to analyze patterns and similarities among huge data sets. Another approach is the chemical similarity analysis. Here actually we find the overlapping regions or the common between two sets which has been generated from two different or more than two different compounds. So it is usually done by evaluating the Tanimoto coefficient or Jaccard index of the corresponding chemical fingerprints. Rapid overlap of chemical structures is a system or model which implements such approach. Now, as we have made informations and stored informations in computer, now we can use machine learning models in order to infer constructive conclusions or come up with different analysis which could be done from.
Ognivo, are you there? Your voice is not reaching there.
Let us wait for some time for the speaker to join. Just wait 2 minutes to our speaker came.
Ognivo has confirmed that he has a network issue. He is trying once. if not possible, we will shift him to the last speaker as the last speaker. His
Okay,
time
okay,
on, sir.
Okay, so let's move on to our next speaker, our fourth
Wait,
speaker or
wait.
last speaker.
Asim, wait, please. He is trying to join one slide now.
Okay, okay.
Just wait some minutes. Yeah. Wait for 2 minutes and then we'll move.
Okay, let's wait 2 minutes.
Hello.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, extremely sorry for the inconvenience. So will I start or
Yes, please share your screen.
okay? So from where I got disconnected. 1 minute. Is it visible?
Yes, it's visible.
So from where will I start? Like from where, just from where I got disconnected.
I think from 8th page.
So I'll start from chemical similarity analysis. So I'm audible, right?
Yes.
So chemical similarity analysis is another approach that basically finds the overlapping region or the similarity between two data sets. In order to do that, we usually evaluate the Tanimoto coefficient or Jacquard index of the chemical fingerprint, and the rapid overlap of chemical structure is such program which implements such approach. Now, as we have got the information stored in computer, now we can apply different machine learning models in order to come up with relevant informations. Now, machine learning is one of the most important and rapidly evolving topics in computer-aided drug discovery. It uses a pattern recognition algorithm to discern mathematical relationship between empirical observations of small molecules and extrapolate them to predict chemical, biological, and physical properties of novel compounds. Now, some of the machine learning models which we use in QSR can be divided into three types rather. The supervised learning model, the unsupervised learning model, and semi-supervised learning model. The supervised learning model, some of the supervised learning models are naive-based model, regression analysis model, k-nearest neighbor model, random forest, support vector machine, or neural network and deep learning. Now, some unsupervised learning models are k-means clustering model, hierarchical clustering, principal component analysis, and independent component analysis model. So what does Dr. Ahuja's lab aims for? Our lab aims to dissect some of the fundamental aspects pertaining to the functional contributions of metabolites in driving essential cellular process or behavior. We use Saccharomyces cerevisiae as a model organism along with computational methods to address their complexity. Now, in a more deeper aspect, we aim to decode the underlying molecular mechanism mediating the induction and regulation of olfactory receptors in non-olfactory tissues. We effectively take advantage of chemoinformatics, molecular biology, and genomic techniques along with machine learning models. Now, what is the conclusion and future scope of this area? Machine learning models are no doubt the future of drug discovery and chemical analysis. With advancement in ML models, time, labor, and intensive chemical research and analysis could be reduced to a great extent. Also, with increase in computational and processing power, storage, and advancement in ML models, resource time and labor-intensive research, which were required previously in this area, could be reduced to a great extent. Lastly, I would like to thank Dr. Gaurav Ahuja and my supervisor and my lab senior, Mr. Sanjay Kumar Mohanty, for their constant guidance. These are some references from which the presentation was made. Thank you. Thanks. And again, sorry for the inconvenience.
Okay, so now it's time for question answer session. So there is a question from Somodeep, that what do you mean by chemical fingerprints?
So each and every chemical structure has a unique set of data. Like these data sets are known as chemical fingerprints. It's actually unique to each and every molecule, so it is known as the chemical fingerprints. These could be used in order to discern the patterns and analyze the patterns between the data of a large compound database, from a large compound database.
Okay, there is another question from Tanmoy Kole, that what is the difference between supervised and unsupervised ML?
Okay, so in supervised learning, the data sets are labeled data sets. So the model is trained in such a way that the model will give us a labeled data set back. Whereas in unsupervised machine learning models, there is no labeled data. It finds or recognizes patterns in a huge data set and comes up with its own bagging systems, or their own data sets, which are similar, or the computer recognizes pattern between the data.
Okay.
Hello.
There are no more questions, and thank you, Ogniva, for this wonderful talk. And let's move on to our next speaker.
Thank you.
Okay. So our last speaker, Priyanka Verma from IIT Bombay. So over to you, Priyanka. You can start sharing your screen and proceed.
Yes, sir. Sir, can you see my screen?
Yes, it is visible.
So, hello everyone, I'm Priyanka, and I will be talking about my work on the project wastewater treatment using superconducting electron beam accelerator. So here's the outline of my presentation. One second, sir. Yeah, so here's the outline. We will be talking about why wastewater treatment is so important, what are the conventional treatment processes, how we can treat wastewater using electron beam, and some results of the treatment, and what is Fluka flare, the simulation results, and the future aspects. So let us come to the next. So India is the second most populous country in the world, and less than 50% of total population of country has access to clean and safe water. The country has enough water sources in form of rivers, lakes, and dams. Still, we are facing water scarcity. So what is the reason behind this? So these are the main reasons behind the water scarcity, like rapid groundwater depletion, drought, overuse and wastage of water, contamination of surface water due to urbanization and industrialization, and we also have lack of sufficient treatment capacity to remove these contaminants and toxic compounds from the water. Thus, we need some efficient methods to treat this polluted water to make it reusable and to be available for all. So we'll see what are the contaminants in water. So heavy metals, halogenated hydrocarbons, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, coliform dyes, industrial pollutants. These are the main contaminants which are found in water that makes the water toxic. And Ganga, which is the largest river in India, provides water to about 40% of India's population and is considered to be the fifth most polluted river in the world. In terms of some parameters, here we can see what is the condition of water in river Ganga at some main locations like Allahabad and Varanasi. We can see from the table that these parameters are way too beyond the permissible limits which are set by the National Green Tribunal. So this is an alarming condition and we cannot use water of Ganga in our day-to-day life. So we have to treat the water to use the sources so So what can be done to remove these contaminants? So we have some conventional treatment processes, but these conventional treatment processes also have their own advantages and disadvantages. Some main disadvantages of these processes are that some of them are corrosive in nature. They produce hazardous chemicals which are carcinogenic, and they are some of them are very slow in processing. They have high exposure time, and they are very ineffective against the microbes. So we want to find an alternate method to treat the wastewater which can overcome all these disadvantages which we are facing through the conventional treatment processes. So we have found that electron beam provides a good alternative to all these conventional treatment processes. So how does electron beam treatment works? So this is the picture. This shows that this is electron beam coming from superconducting electron accelerator, which is falling on the water, and it degrades the organic chemical compounds and makes the water purified. So these are some advantages of electron beam over conventional methods, that it does not require any type of chemicals for the purification. It removes odor, color, and microorganisms effectively. It reduces the COD, BOD levels to permissible limits. It is easy to handle. It works on switch on and off. So it is less physical work is required. It does not create any harmful or carcinogenic compounds, and it is faster than conventional methods. So what is the working of electron beam treatment? So here you can see when ionizing radiation falls on H2 molecule, it either excites the molecule or ionizes it. And by further processing, this leads to formation of reactive species, which further reacts to surrounding molecules, making the molecules non-toxic. So here we can see some main reactions involved. In this reaction, we can see the free radicals opens up the benzene, the aromatic rings and organic compounds, and makes it non-degradable. And also the conjugated double bond compounds, which are responsible for color in the water, these free radicals react with them and makes them single bond compounds. Similarly, they act with sulfide atoms and also heavy metals and make them treatable. Also, these electrons interact with cellular atoms, which breaks the DNA of microorganisms and destroys their tendency to reproduce, thus this makes electron beam effective against microorganisms also, which cannot be treated through conventional processes. So this is the yield of reactive species. Now we come to the results. So these are some results obtained from pilot plant at Tegu Dyeing Industrial Complex, where the water from textile industries was treated with energy of electron beam of 1 MeV. So this is the TOC and COD, chemical oxygen demand and total organic compound parameters for raw sample. This is after the existing biochemical treatment, and this is after the electron beam irradiation. So we can see there is significant decrease in the in these parameters. Also, there are some additional advantages, that treatment time is reduced. There is increase in flow rate, and the 70 to 80% of water can be reused in paper producing process after EB treatment. But we don't have this electron beam treatment technology in India. So we are taking the initiative to establish this technology, but with improved version, which is also economically beneficial, compact in size, and it can be established in very large extent. So we come to so we have to do some simulations to optimize our calculations and to do the experiments. So we are using the Fluka Flare simulation software. So what is Fluka Flare? Fluka is a particle interaction and transport Monte Carlo code born in 60s. It is used in many applications. And these are some interactions that can be simulated with Fluka. And Flare is a graphical interface to Fluka, which provides a user-friendly editing of Fluka input file. Now we have done some simulations for electron beam of energy of 1 MeV, and these are some simulation results. So I have done the simulations with the electron beam with annular cross section with radius 6 mm, and this is the dose deposition in water on the surface of the water, and it gives the that the dose deposition is up to 1 centimeter in the water for 6 mm annular cross section electron beam. Also, the penetration depth for this electron beam is 4 mm in the water. So it suggests the depth and radius of the container for the effective treatment of water. So now we will be simulating these for different energies, and these results are obtained for these energies. We are having this much radius and penetration depth. So we can take our container size according to these to optimize our results or treatment process. So these are, so thus we can use Fluka Flare simulation for the calculation of size of container for different energy values of the beam. Also for the dose calculation, we can use this Fluka Flare simulations, and to prevent the outside environment from the electron beam irradiation, we have to calculate the shielding, width of the shielding. We can also use this simulation to calculate that also. So what are the future aspects of the project? So we can, if we will be able to establish this type of treatment plants, then we can treat a large amount of polluted water to water bodies like rivers, dams, and lakes. And this treated water is safe to be used in day-to-day life and can be provided to the regions with a scarcity of water. This overall process is economically beneficial. The electron beam technology also has applications in other areas like listed here. And we are working towards establishing superconducting electron beam accelerator technology in collaboration with KEK Japan. This project has also been accepted by National Mission of Clean Ganga. And we have also allowed to establish this water treatment plant at Asti Ghat, Varanasi. So we are working towards establishing this plant at Asti Ghat, Varanasi, and we are hoping for the best so that we can make our future better and to overcome the water crisis. So these are some references and acknowledgement. Okay, thank you.
Okay, now it's time for question and answer session. And there is a question from Tanmoy Kole, that what is the estimated cost to prepare such a water treatment plant? Priyanka, are you there? Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's audible now.
Yeah. So the establishment cost is 68 rupees per 1000 liter of water. So we can calculate the overall cost for the plant by this data. Yeah. Hello.
Okay. There is a question from another one, Bhasit Pal, that what is the significance of using the Monte Carlo code which was developed in 60s? Can we renovate the program for the simulation? Priyanka, you are not audible.
Hello, sir. Am I audible now?
Yeah, you know.
Yeah. So I'm just seeing in the chat what is the significance of using the Monte Carlo code? Yeah, so Monte Carlo code is used in when there is some unpredictability and we have to and there is some One second, sir. Can we renovate the program for simulation? Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah. Yeah, this Monte Carlo code was developed in 60s, but this is the renovated version of that that is developed by CERN. It is being renovated over time, and we are using the renewed version of it. So next question is, can we use this method in future for large scale? Yeah, we can use this method for treating water in large water bodies like rivers, like lakes. It has a very bright future in the area of research of wastewater treatment. If we will be able to establish these types of treatment plants, then I think we will be able to overcome all of the issues that we are facing today, because this is economically beneficial also. This removes all of the impurities that are present in water, and also the the process is very fast. It does not take much time to so it is a flow through process, so we can get instant purified water through this process. So this can be used in future, like can we clear seawater also? No, we have not considered this aspect yet. Hello.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Priyanka, for this wonderful talk. And
Thank you,
we are,
sir.
yeah. Now we have to come to end of the program. And thank you so much to all our speakers for sharing such a great presentation, and also to our audience. Thanks for touch with us. And let me hand over to Isuju. So over to you, Isuju.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
I would like to thank all the participants for their wonderful talk. We shall end this session over here, and for people who want to continue the discussion can do so on the Slack channel. Now I am handing over the mic to Shomudip Pundu. Over to you, Shomudip.
Hello. Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Thank you. And my video is on.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So a very thank you to all of our participants today, and we have such great sessions with the two symposium, one is from astrophysics and cosmology, and the second from condensed matter physics and interdisciplinary sessions. We also have a great session with our alumni in the morning, and I would like to thank all of our audience to make patience and see all of the talks. I will request all of the participants to post their slides to our Slack channel so that the discussion will go on. And tomorrow we have another 2 sessions of UG Symposium, that is of astrophysics and high energy physics, and the second on theoretical physics. And at the night, tomorrow night, we have a public talk from a great eminent scientist, Dr. Adam Bayas. So I will request everyone to present tomorrow as well. And this is the end for today. Thank you very much for attending.